Hello students, welcome to the ergonomics lecture. So today we'll be mainly talking on memory. So we have already covered the other aspects of cognition like attention, perception, sensation in our previous classes, and today we'll be moving forward with discussion on memory. So before we jump on to the section of memory, let's have a quick recap of what we had covered in the previous classes. So we got introduced to the term cognitive ergonomics, which consists of two terms, cognition and ergonomics. And we saw that cognitive ergonomics is basically the branch of ergonomics which focuses on the design of a task or a system in consideration based on the cognitive limitations and abilities of a person. And we have seen that cognition is a umbrella term for processes like perception, memory, information processing, reasoning, and everything leading to motor response, right? And we have also seen that authors like Hallnagel has described cognitive ergonomics having two objectives, that is how task affects the mind, and on the other hand how mind affects the task. And we have also seen the scientific disciplines which are related to cognitive ergonomics. Uh, they are like neuroscience, cognitive science, computer science, consumer sciences, mechanical sciences, and others. And we have also seen the application areas of cognitive ergonomics like work system and task design in general, human computer interaction, user experience design, usability engineering, signage design, package design, retail design, in visual communication, in consumer product design, as well as in fashion design, and also in emotional product design. And we have seen that attention is basically the behavioral and cognitive process of selectively concentrating on a specific stimulus while ignoring other stimuli present in the environment. And we have also seen there are various models to describe attention, like one is the visual attention, where in the first stage attention is distributed uniformly over a particular environment, and in the second stage attention is concentrated on a very specific stimulus, right? For example, when I am uh, finding out a certain person sitting in an audience, so my at first instance my gaze will fall over the entire audience, and then once I sort of spot a person, then my gaze will be sort of fixated on that person, right? And we have also seen the spotlight model, and it's basically it can be easily demonstrated while you are reading through a book or a text. So there are these three elements, which is focus, fringe, and margin. So focus is basically the word which is on which you are sort of reading at the present moment, or the letters of it can be also the letters of a word. And fringe is basically the adjoining words which are basically blurry in nature. And also the margin is the boundary where beyond which the objects are not in our attention. And there is a similar model called the zoom lens model, which where we can see the diameter or the size of the margin can sort of expand or contract. Based on it, the area of focus will also sort of encompass more elements or less elements. So one thing to be noted here is that if more things are in focus, then the processing of the information will sort of also decrease. And we have also seen that focused attention, there are different types of attention. So now, till now, we have sort of discussed what are the different models to describe attention, but there are also different types of attention, like focused attention, where it is basically the brain's ability to concentrate on a attention on a target for a particular period of time. So in focused attention, time component is important. And so we have gone through these examples in class. And there is also this thing of selective attention, where in selective attention basically means that you are selectively attending to a particular stimulus present in the environment, and you are ignoring all other possible stimuli. So basically, you can think of it as when you walk onto a consumer uh, electronic store, you are focusing your attention to the latest model of iPhone, and you are sort of ignoring all the other brands which might be possibly there in the store. So we have gone through these specific examples in class, and there is also divided attention. Divided attention is basically means when your attention is divided, um, when you are sort of doing multitasking, right? So basically, one good example of this can be when you are in workplace, then you are doing some work on computer, you are doing some paperwork, you are also attending to some work in telephone, right? So all this multitasking sort of demands attention to be divided across multiple tasks, right? Again, how to measure attention. So this is with respect to the graphical user interface. Like there are two components to it: on which part of the screen or on which element the eye gaze of the user is falling predominantly. And the second thing is the time component. I mean, how much time the user takes to gaze at a particular target from the start of the session. So the first thing can be measured using a eye tracker, and the second thing, which is the time measurement, can be measured by videographing or screen recording the session, and also by using the eye tracker. So then we moved on to the faculty of sensation. Sensation is basically the process that captures the sensory information in forms of light or sound, and conversion of that energy into neural impulses, right? So these energies or this specific stimulus need to be converted into neural impulses to be for further information processing or for storage in memory, right? So this is basically transduction of environmental stimuli into neural impulses. So we have also seen perception. Perception is basically, I mean, the information which you are gathering from your sense organs. What do you make out of it, right? So as you can see, the definition as per Scatter and Daniel, perception is the organization, identification, and interpretation of sensory information in order to represent and understand the presented information or the environment. So what do you make out of the information which is presented to you? So we have covered such theories in class, and perception with respect to different senses, and also the examples of perception. So one of the example which we discussed in class was that whenever you see an image of a product or any object, so you're basically seeing only one side of it. So but in your mind you are reconstructing it in three-dimensional space, right? Because of your existing knowledge, or which is coming basically through perception. So now today we'll be starting with memory. So memory is basically whatever information you are gathering from your senses. So how are you sort of encoding it and also storing it for later use, right? So let's delve into the definition of memory. So memory is basically the faculty of brain by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved when needed. So this definition is from Sherwood, uh, which is published in Human Physiology from Cells to Systems. And memory is basic, which is very vital to experiences, because it is the retention of information over time for the purpose of influencing future action. So if we don't have any memory of how to do anything, right? Or if we if our memory is totally empty, so we can't make any sort of any decisions, right? And if we can't remember past events, we cannot learn basically the language skills. We can't even identify people or relationships, or our own personal identity. So, according to Oslon, who proposed in 1985 that memory does not act as a unitary whole, but it comprises of three entities, which is the sensory register, number two is the short-term memory, and number three is the long-term memory, right? So, three separate entities of memory is sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So let's see what sensory memory is. So sensory memory or sensory register serves as a momentary collection of sensory input. So whatever information you are exposed in an environment, and whatever information is collected by your sense organs. Uh, so sensory short-term sensory memory is like, you whatever information you have collected, and it is very much the collected memory is basically the short-term sensory memory. And in many times we don't have any control over sensory memory, uh, because information is always sort of coming from the environment to us. And but in sometimes we sort of if we are paying closer attention to a particular stimulus, then we are basically channeling our the information which we are sort of getting from the environment. Now coming into the one of the most important type of memory is the short-term memory, right? So short-term memory is basically the memory which is available for a short period of time, say 20 to 30 seconds, right? So short-term memory is the capacity of holding a small amount of information in mind in an active, readily available state for a short period of time. For example, let's take an example of where you asked your friend for a certain some other guy's phone number, and you are sort of keeping it in your memory for say 20 to 30 seconds max, and before noting it down. So that is an example of short-term memory, where you are sort of holding a certain amount of, usually a small chunk of information in your mind for a short period of time. But basically you are holding it, but you are not manipulating it. And so this is one important thing to be noted. And because there is a similar term which is also called working memory, and short-term memory is basically a bit different from working memory, because working memory is both holding and manipulating the memory in short span of time. But short-term memory is only holding a specific information for a short period of time, right? So we'll be getting into those differences between short-term memory and working memory a bit later. But few of the characteristics of short-term memory is that it can be say it is um, only available for maximum 20 to 30 seconds, and it is poor for keeping a large volume of information, right? You can only store a small chunk of information, and it is more sort of fragile or volatile than long-term memory, because you might tend to forget it, or you might commit some mistakes or errors while trying to retrieve from your short-term memory. And individual can control short-term memory and can maintain information by grouping information, making items distinctive and rehearsing. So for example, when we are sort of noting down any number, right? So any phone number, say, where suppose we are holding it temporarily in our mind for 20 to 30 seconds. So suppose let's take an example of phone number like 78384144864. So this is, if you say in this fashion, the what happens is that you are usually tending to forget. But if you chunk those information like 7838414864, so there is three chunks, so you have grouped the information, and so this can be more easily you are able to sort of um, you can retrieve from your short-term memory. So coming to long-term memory, as proposed by Richard Atkinson and Schriffen in 1968 in their memory model, is the information which is held indefinitely for an indefinite period of time. So, and it is generally stored in a in a visual format, or in an auditory format, or maybe in some other semantic format or abstract format, depending on what is the information you are storing, and also depends on also the on the human who is storing the information, right? So for example, many of you can sort of store some text into, say, visual format and store it in your long-term memory, right? So we usually are not storing a text as text in our memory, but it is either in form of visual or in form of combination of visual, auditory, or some semantic formats. And long-term memory has a large capacity, and it can be said it can be virtually permanent. For example, some memory from your childhood can even be persisting still today, and yeah, and it has the very limitless capacity. And humans can control over long-term memory by again encoding the information into rich meanings, and also linking terms together, and also by being clever at finding items that appear to be lost. So for example, there is some piece of information. If you want to sort of put it in a long-term memory, you can sort of link it with other similar information. uh, so that also helps in in a long-term memory. And also, if you are sort of personally extracting more and more meaning out of a particular information, then you are also able to sort of enhance your long-term memory, right? And if you sort of again trying to dig up some memory, which you think is not present now, then you can sort of use various techniques to sort of uh, retrieve that information. For example, you can think of retrieving first the other information which was linked to that specific information, and once those adjacent informations are retrieved, the main information can also be retrieved. So like this, there are many techniques of where you can sort of exercise your long-term memory and also retrieve information from LTM. Okay, so here in this slide, we'll see some of the characteristic differences between sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory with respect to some specific aspects of the information which are to be stored in the memory. So as you can see here, that so here is the feature, and feature is basically some features of the information. For example, uh, the what the information which is sort of fed in through our senses. So what it takes to get the information in, and now once the information is fed, how the information is maintained, and once it is maintained, how long will it last, and how will it sort of dissipate, right? And what are the, in which format will the information be stored in each of our uh, memory faculties, and stuff like that. So how much information can be held, and how will the information be sort of uh, decay over time, like how will you sort of forget the information, right? So let's start with it. So how the information is sort of fed in. So it basically gets fed in through our senses. So either a person can be attending to a certain stimulus, or it can be unattended. uh, a person may be unaware of a certain stimulus, but still the information is sort of entering through his senses, and then in to sort of invoke the short-term memory. So it is basically through attention and cognition, and uh, for any information to take into the long-term memory, so it requires repetition, rehearsal, or coding. Information maintenance is not possible in a sensory register. For short-term memory, information can be maintained through continued attention or rehearsal. So you have to sort of continually attend to a specific information, and in long-term memory it is not uh, necessary to sort of maintain an information, because once it goes into a long term, it is usually maintained, right? And this is an important thing, how long an unmaintained trace of information lasts. So in sensory register, it is about up to 2 seconds. How this is the time till when the information lasts. In short-term memory, the information can last up to 30 seconds, and in long-term memory, it can last for few minutes to several years, right? So, and what is the format of the information which is sort of fed in through each of these faculties is that in sensory faculty, it is the literal input in form of whatever it is, text, it can be through light, audio, whatever the stimulus is fed in. And in short term memory, it is usually through auditory. For example, when you are sort of looking at this word, so AUDITORY, so it is sort of fed in as sort of letters, which is basically some visual elements which you are seeing here. But in your short-term memory, it gets fed as an instruction through audition, right? So you are sort of telling to yourself, this is this chunk of letters sum up, it's the auditory word, right? So hence it's auditory. And in long-term memory, whatever information, say you are sort of so you are perceiving now, you are sort of making some sort of visual connections in your to make some meaning out of that information which you are sort of exposed to. You can sort of abstractize any information to be fed into a long-term memory. Okay, and it can be also be auditory, semantic, etc. And now the thing is, how much information can be held in each of these faculties. For example, sensory register is like very small. I mean, it's like an instantaneous. So it can be like 5 letters in auditory format, 9 letters in visual format. And in short-term memory, you usually there are sort of 7 plus minus 2 chunks. So it is basically from 5 to 9 chunks of information you can hold in your short-term memory, right? So chunks means, as I had given the example of remembering a phone number. So usually you chunk uh, uh, three or four numbers. So a set of three or four numbers becomes one chunk. And in long-term memory, there is virtually no sort of limit to a long-term memory. And also, how do you forget information? So in sensory register, there is once the information is fed in, so it is also sort of it gets also decayed. So because what happens in sensory register is like information is coming throughout time, right? So one input will sort of override the other previous inputs. So similarly for short-term memory also, so decay also happens, but not as fast as sensory register, but decay is happening because when you are sort of for at this instant of time you are focusing on this cell, right? So this is the cell where you are sort of focusing at, but next instant of time you will be focusing on, say, this cell. So when you are sort of focusing on this cell of information, you will sort of most probably lose the track of what was there uh, in this cell of information. So again, in long-term memory, so once the memory has been fed into a long-term, there is no possible loss of that information until and unless you have incurred some brain injury or things like dementia or other diseases. Okay. So this is one of the examples of memory where every time you see the FedEx logo and once you know that there is an arrow here, you know, so every time you will see the FedEx logo, you will be reminded of this arrow, right? Like this, there are plenty of examples which are used in uh, design in product stream, interaction stream, communication stream, which involves all these uh, faculties of our mind. So now let's move on to the second process of cognition, which is information processing. So after we have completed, say, attention, we have completed sensation, perception, memory, and now it is information processing. So so what is information processing is basically whatever data you have gathered from your uh, sense organs and also whatever data you have in your memory. So in order to sort of process or compute any information, so what happens within us? So that is basically what comes under information processing. So in 1992, Wickens described a qualitative model of human information processing that incorporates stages which are used to perceive sensations, transform data, and choose action, right? So, and each of the stages takes some time to perform. So let's see in this in the form of a chart. So information processing model, you can see this is the chart adapted from Weekends. So we have the stimuli in our environment. We are receiving the stimuli through the receptors, which are our sense organs, and then it is going to the sensory memory or short-term sensory store, and after that it is going to the perception faculty, right? And based on the perception, we'll be going to the decision making phase, right? And once the decision is made, we'll be sort of selecting what response to be sort of given for this particular stimulus, and then we do the response execution and leading to the responses. And again, respond when we sort of respond back to the environment, it will again sort of uh, affect the environment, and it will also again feed into the stimuli, and it will again feed back to the receptors. So this whole thing is called the feedback. right? And here one more important thing is that when you are doing decision making, right, so there is also a to and fro relation between the working memory as well as the long term memory. So here let me sort of tell you what the difference between the working memory and the short term memory is, uh, right? Or so working memory is basically to do with not only the retention of information but also manipulation of information for a short period of time, right? So suppose let's take an example of when you are playing a game. So with respect to different game, there can be different keys of the keyboard which are used to evoke different functions. But say for a particular game, uh, key A is used for say jumping, right? This is the instruction which has been given to you. Key A for jumping, right? But that is fed as a short-term memory or STM. But once you sort of know this information and you are sort of actually pressing the key A for jumping or making the jump move in a particular game, so that becomes the working memory, right? So working memory sort of influences our response selections as well as our actions, right? And working memory is also influenced by our long-term memory, because suppose there may be some information in our long-term memory which sort of tells us what would you be doing now, right? So it is sort of influencing the working memory, which in turns is sort of influencing the decision making. And our long-term memory will also affect the how we perceive things, right? So there is a sort of a web here, or bi-directional relations between perception, decision making, working memory and long-term memory. So let's go through this once again. So again, when we have the stimulus from the environment, receptors through our sense organs, short-term sensory store. So again, this is the sensory memory, and this is different from the short-term memory (STM). So uh, again, from the sensory store it is going to the perception to decision making and response selection to response execution and responses. And here in response selections, our working memory is sort of uh, affecting our response selection and decision making, which in turn is affected by the long term memory, right? And long term memory will also sort of influence how we perceive things. So hope you have got a overall idea of how the information processing happens overall in our mind. And yeah, so we'll be continuing on with the next lectures, so stay tuned.